We're Project Myopia. This is just after our 4-year anniversary. We began by being funded by the University of Edinburgh's Innovation Initiative grant, and we're currently funded by the London Arts and Humanities Partnership. So this conference is our second. It comes after one that we had a couple of years ago in person, an anniversary celebration in 2019. So we're hoping to update that. That was a much smaller, very intimate conversation between lots of different, lots of representatives from different university decolonisation groups, and we're hoping to do something larger. So to kick us off today, I just want us to think through what decolonisation is and why we should do it. I've nicked this from the Decolonising Liberal Arts at KCL page because I thought it was a fantastic little potted definition, where decolonising is the process of transforming individual, collective and institutional structures of racism founded in the legacies of colonisation. Chandra Mohanty argues that decolonising educational practices requires transformations at a number of levels, both within and outside the academy. Curricular and pedagogical transformation has to be accompanied by a broad-based transformation of the culture of the academy, as well as by radical shifts in the relation of the academy to other state and civil institutions. And we at Project Myopia take that very much at heart. So we have our core function when we started was to think about how curriculum could be more inclusive, but also we now deliver these teaching workshops to think through about how pedagogical practice needs to accommodate a more diverse institution. So all of these things together are very important in terms of talking about the institution we would like to exist in. Okay, welcome back. So I'm just going to introduce this session. This is our first paper on the fallacy of decolonising higher education institutions. So announcing our first panelists, we have Dr. Mariam Jamila and Nadia Mehdi from the University of Sheffield, reflecting on the barriers thrown up by scholars and practitioners within decolonial practice at UK universities. So their bios: Mariam Jamila is a researcher and writer working in contemporary literature and politics, trauma and decoloniality. She currently works as an investigative journalist, a podcast host and a research collective member. Her PhD from the University of Sheffield examined constructions of South Asian Muslim women in literature, film and music with a focus on building frameworks of trauma that incorporate critiques of power systems via necropolitics. And Nadia Mehdi works broadly within the traditions of feminist philosophy and philosophy of race, and teaches philosophy at the university and school level in the UK. Her current research focuses on oppression and resistance in the aesthetic realm and is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Public philosophy was her passion. She organises events in and around Sheffield, and she has written a book, Crash Course Philosophy, and contributed chapters to 30-Second Feminism. So thank you so much, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, hi everyone. So we're going to give a version of our paper that we wrote in linear time. It was 2 years ago, but I feel like in pandemic time, it was about 70 years ago. So a lot has changed since then. So this is clearly an area where there's a huge amount of discourse and there's lots of different opinions, and I think it's important to acknowledge the people that have come before us. So that's what we're going to do over the next 20 minutes or so, and we're going to give you a couple of case studies to kind of tease our ideas out and explain where we're coming from.
So we're going to be talking about the barriers that face decolonisation projects. We've written Western, we mean UK universities. We don't have experience anywhere else. And we're talking about the kind of barriers that come from within rather than without. Barriers that are thrown up by mostly white scholars and practitioners who articulate a desire to decolonise that then in no way changes their actions. those who diffuse the decolonising incursion with more palatable alternatives whilst uncritically upholding white supremacy, ableism, homophobia and transphobia through an inherited adherence to the status quo. Decolonisation is becoming an exhausted term. No offence to those that still abide by it. And we've become accustomed to seeing it misappropriated, misapplied and misused by white race scholars, white institutions and white diversity initiatives. Scholars and activists of colour have long discussed the possibilities and applications of the term, and it would be remiss not to mention Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's prescient and compelling work on the use of decolonisation. They argue, and then this is a long quote, "When metaphor invades decolonisation, it kills the very possibility of decolonisation. It recenters whiteness, it resettles theory, it extends innocence to the settler, it entertains a settler future. Decolonise, a verb, and decolonisation, a noun, cannot easily be grafted onto pre-existing discourses, frameworks, even if they are critical, even if they are anti-racist, even if they are justice frameworks. Easy absorption, adoption, and transposing of decolonisation is yet another form of settler appropriation. When we write about decolonisation, we're not offering it as a metaphor. It is not an approximation of other experiences of oppression. It's not a swappable term for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. Decolonisation doesn't have a synonym." So to put it another way, decolonisation doesn't have to be and can't be everything to everyone. Attempts to decolonise curriculums, reading lists and spaces are so often doomed because they don't begin from a robust encounter with what decolonisation is. Tuck and Yang's argument warns us against grafting decolonisation onto pre-existing frameworks because to do so is to move the focus away from critiquing, dismantling and displacing settler colonialism. They argue that when this happens, decolonisation is merely emptied out only to be filled back up with a centering of white supremacist logic, a piecemeal strategy which carries a sheen of anti-racism with no substance or clarity. People of colour are already too aware of this process being enacted by white institutions and white allies on terms as wide-ranging as BAME, diversity and intersectionality.
Tuck and Yang also warn about the danger of perpetuating settler colonialism through decolonisation, and Yarima Bonilla also shares Tuck and Yang's reluctance to stand by the use of decolonisation and argues that decentering settler colonialism from the decolonial project by definition can't be decolonial. So the quote reads, "I remain sceptical as to whether one could truly decolonise either sovereignty or anthropology, given that there is no pre-colonial status to which either could return." So we'll get back to the question of the future of decolonisation by the end of the presentation. But for now, when we consider the predicament that these writers put forward for us, it's a problem which can be summarised as saying that decolonisation that doesn't have the organising principle of engaging with dismantling settler colonialism isn't any kind of decolonisation. So when Rihanna asked earlier, like if you had unlimited funds, what would you do to change university spaces? My initial thought was, with unlimited funds, just tear the whole thing down. Like that has to be a fundamental part of decolonial work, which is to say, raise it to the ground, salt the earth, and begin again. So I think it's interesting to think about a possible linearity of time that's implicit in the word decolonisation and what it means if we think about it in a temporal way. So we're aware that that kind of critique, on the other hand, is something that can be taken as a sign of hopelessness or a lack of faith in liberation or justice in anti-racist work. But such a sign, however, would be mistaken. Our critiques are rooted in the need that scholars of colour carry on our backs for anti-racist work as a requirement of living in worlds that often seek to shrink us. Decolonisation is not an intellectual exercise for so many communities that are committed to anti-racist work. It's the condition of not only our survival, but our capacity to thrive. We've seen through generations, as Nadia mentioned with BAME and diversity and intersectionality, that there are these terms that come in and out of vogue. And Bonilla has an interesting term, which is the word unsettling, which indicates that these terms that come in and out of vogue are receptacles. They are vessels that carry us to where we need to be for the moment, but we don't need to tie our flag to it, so to speak. So in order to kind of work through some of those ideas, we've got a couple of examples, and Nadia's going to do the first one, which is about a decolonisation task force.
There we go. Normally I'm just a listener at these things. So yeah, that's right. In 2019, we were invited by the Arts and Humanities faculty, senior management, to partake in a task force that focused on decolonising the curriculum. The initiative was just incredibly performative and an ostentatious response to student-led decolonisation projects, but also the unveiling of like a university race equality strategy. So it wasn't an attempt to confront the colonial workings of the faculty, in spite of the multiple structures of racism that privilege white home students and denigrate students of colour. The process was just frankly arduous and excruciating. From the start, there was a refusal to accept the enormity and structural dimensions of the problem. And in the spirit of unsettling, our group proposed a vision of a decolonised curriculum that inevitably involved a radical shape-up of the organisation, the faculty, and the contents of its courses. Unsurprisingly, that vision was not welcomed by the senior management of the faculty. The sole staff member on the task force agreed that, of course, we were correct to question the aims of the university as a colonial institution, but only at this juncture, after we'd proposed our plans, shared that the task force had both a limited lifespan and that its true purpose was to produce an event to coincide with it's subtitles, that's awesome. To coincide with the unveiling of the race equality strategy. She informed us that she'd been hoping we might hold an event in one of the university's foyers and make a lot of noise to signal our unhappiness with the status quo. Upon stating our concern with the optics and outputs involved in producing a one-off event, given our initial goals, the staff member stated that she understood if we felt unable to continue on the task force. We decided to stay because, unlike many decolonisation projects, this was a paid gig. But this also easy dissolution from the one white and most senior person in the room sat uncomfortably, of course. White people will often rush to agree and attempt to preempt the objections people of colour may have to situations that are asking too much of us. This rush to concession often prompted from a place of white guilt. We're positioned as correct in calling out that which is problematic, but there's no real engagement in the content of our speech. And it would appear that it does not matter if the subaltern can speak, as long as the liberal can be seen to agree. Decolonisation is not a metaphor for resisting oppression, and yet it lends itself so easily to being used as one in the hands of the wrong people, who hear the cries of the oppressed within their university and seize on this term, whose meaning they don't understand, as a catch-all save. Asking us to decolonise the curriculum without the opportunity to recommend structural change was predetermined to have an output. As Nairanta Shioran Appleton puts it, to take on decolonising work without ever engaging with the long tradition of scholars who have written on decolonising is sloppy and opportunistic. White supremacy requires the cooperation of white people, and the social milieu hardwires them to enact their willing engagement in ensuring settler futurity through colonial environments. The requested event was never going to be decolonial, given that it employed brown faces for a tokenistic marketing event that served to position the university to appear as committed to anti-race work. Eventually, what transpired is that we held a small event for other students of colour to share the ways in which the university had broken them. We recognised the need for a space for cathartic venting before a process of change and healing could begin, although the money ran dry before that was ever going to happen. Therein perhaps lies the problem. Many students of colour simply can't afford to heal from wounds that are written into us from generations previous. Materially, money is required to afford the physical space to reckon with the increasingly knotty racist interactions that are part and parcel of university life. One must have enough money to pay rent, to eat, to be able to meet their peers in social spaces and to recharge. The consideration of emotional spaces, of collectivity and networks of support is a fantasy for many. Piecemeal events such as ours merely plaster over the cracks for a short amount of time.
Our next case study is about the idea of solidarity and UCU, the University and Colleges Union. At the time that when we were writing this, there were a number of strikes that were going on, and a report from Universities UK found that universities hadn't been prioritising tackling racial violence on campuses. General Secretary Joe Grady said universities should be safe spaces for all staff and students, free from harassment and discrimination, but there's still much work to be done to make this a reality. UCU in particular, however, have been criticised by staff and students of colour for their approach, or rather their lack of approach, to racial harassment. Whilst UCU do attempt to provide comments on race-related incidents or reports, we feel that you can reasonably argue that a core part of UCU's strategy as a commitment to anti-racist work doesn't actually provide sustained support for staff of colour. For example, UCU's General Election Manifesto involves a 6-point plan that sets out commitments for the incoming government to prioritise funding and investment, post-16 education, make international staff and students welcome in the UK, resist increased managerialism in higher ed, tackle unfairness in university admissions, promote sustainability and climate change targets at universities, and invest in the education workforce. In some ways, UCU's statement of tackling the hostile environment is one that is central to university life in the UK, but viewed within the context of UCU policies, operations, and strategies, we can see a different picture. It's difficult to imagine for us a situation where UCU staff or membership would make challenging the hostile environment or engaging more broadly in anti-racist work as a policy that can be taken seriously and trusted to function effectively. UCU have demonstrated little understanding or willingness to incorporate anti-racism as a core strategy. When would there be strike action concerning the rampant and structural racism that is built into UK universities? What have white UCU members and staff done to develop their own understanding of an intersectional approach to racial violence? The problems faced by staff and students with anti-blackness, Islamophobia, intersections of ableism, transphobia, and homophobia are complex and wide-ranging. There are also problems which have been painstakingly articulated by scholars of colour and activists, and our reticence at the effectiveness of UCU in this area comes from the understanding that without reckoning with the hostile environment, with racial capitalism, with structural racism, and the project of continuing white supremacy, UCU cannot reckon effectively with precarity, barriers for international students and staff, climate change, or any of the other commitments that they outline. We find it difficult to swallow affirmations of how universities should be safe spaces when we have seen how racist colleagues, indifferent management, and ineffective unions move through these spaces, often at the cost of people like us. To paraphrase James Baldwin, how can I believe what you say when I see what you do? The silence we are faced with when it comes to thinking about UCU's movements has been critiqued as selling members of colour down the river that is rooted in an unwillingness and a practiced inability to reckon with colonial and white supremacist institutions. Asking precarious workers of colour, who are already multiply marginalised, for their solidarity and unity on picket lines and in strike action, fails to recognise that these same picket lines involve standing shoulder to shoulder with people who have racially abused and targeted us. Instead, as is often the case of scholars of colour, we are left to make our own networks and to build our own spaces with each other and carry out our own union work and our own solidarity work in support of one another. If we don't, who else will?
So, what's next? Is it even ever going to be possible to decolonise white Western universities? Out of the strategies available, equality, diversity, inclusivity, internationalisation, decolonisation, or liberation, which is viable, which is desirable? We answer that diversity is unavoidable, no matter how much top universities try to prevent the admission of students of colour. Equality doesn't entail equity or justice, but an inclusivity without equality is unpalatable. Internationalisation doesn't mean to those in power what it means to us. A university which rinses overseas students for their money, whilst not providing them with any support, versus a vision of a university that holds a pluriverse of epistemologies and life worlds within itself. And we've outlined the pitfalls of an allied attempt at decolonisation. As Tuck and Yang said, decolonisation as metaphor allows people to equivate these contradictory decolonial desires because it turns decolonisation into an empty signifier to be filled by any track towards liberation. In reality, the tracks walk all over land, people, and settler colonial contexts. The removal of settler contexts and the centrality of land theories of decolonisation speaks to the weighty currency of empty signifiers, which in this case equip institutions with the tools necessary to blunt the force of attempts to upheave the status quo. This process itself is driven by settler preoccupation with individual innocence and guilt at the cost of reckoning with the morality of coloniality and the structures and institutions it has spawned. Where this is the case, or rather, given that this is the case, the modified suggestions we hear so often linked to calls for decolonisation and other appropriated buzzwords du jour are in reality calls for personal career advancement. For instance, the list on the screen is like a standard decolonisation manifesto to hire diverse staff, make universities safe for students of colour, rethink what knowledges are, democratise and diversify the curriculum.
We're not suggesting that there's no good that can come from these guidelines, but we are suggesting that they do very little to unsettle the status quo. To return to Tug and Yang, they pointed out that this kind of work allows settler scholars to gain professional kudos or a boost in their reputation for being so sensitive or self-aware. Yet settler moves to innocence are hollow, they only serve the settler. The institutionalization of these suggestions requires people of color to be seen to agree with this kind of work, whilst acknowledging or knowing that it is not liberation work. This isn't decolonization. Decolonization requires resistance, upheaval, and the end of the university as we know it. So we must land on the side of liberation then. We cannot help but feel that this liberation must lie in the collectivity and network of support that we mentioned earlier. It is, however, a collectivity that does not have its place alongside settler whiteness. We can't keep developing terms that encapsulate global manifestations of white supremacy in disparate disciplines and areas, only to have these terms co-opted by white institutions who seek to dull the sharpness of these tools in service of allowing people of color a seat at the table. Too often, participation in white supremacist logics is couched as liberation, when resistance and overthrow is the only remedy. We need to move away from the idea that blanket solidarity is the only way to achieve liberation and towards an attention to difference that is invested in difference as a path to justice. Ultimately, decolonization is the latest liberation framework to have been swept up in the university's cyclical machinery, where funding isn't provided for frameworks to develop, where short-term projects are rife that aren't able to achieve material change. Critique of the academy from the margins mirrors this process. We inadvertently forget or misplace the fact that many scholars of color have come before us and have said and thought the same things. We need to reframe what we consider to be progress. We need to acknowledge that where progress is achieved, nothing will look even vaguely similar.
So our next speaker is Dr. Hannah Marie Robbins. Hannah Marie Robbins is an assistant professor in popular music and director of Black Studies at the University of Nottingham. She is an expert on the intersections of Blackness, queerness, and gender in American musical theatre. Last summer, her short-form article on diversity and representation in the hit musical Hamilton went viral and has received over 100,000 views. Hannah is an advocate in progress for equality in higher education. She is a co-founder of the international network Black in the Arts and Humanities and a member of the radical collective, the Free Black University. In Hannah's contribution, she will reflect on the multiple positionalities we take in order to make change to curricula and pedagogical environments. She draws from an ongoing case study in her own teaching to talk about how these positional changes can make significant differences in majority white classrooms while intervening in negative conditions commonly experienced by staff and students of colour. Hannah will also consider how, through the contortions of institutional practice, we as actors can replicate toxicity in our efforts to change teaching practices. In concluding, Hannah will highlight why decolonising the curriculum must centre people and behaviours, and that a system of accountability at odds with the processes of higher education in the UK is central to our future success in reshaping university education. Okay, take it away, Hannah.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. Apologies that my pronouns are not in my title. For some reason, Zoom is making me change that, but my pronouns are she, they. I think that serendipitously, this is quite a helpful follow-on talk from the one that we just heard from Mariam and Nadia. And I think it's also quite funny to me because I was partially involved in the conversation on the other side of one of those case studies, and it's fascinating to hear the same interaction taking place on both sides of that dialogue. I think also, just as a disclaimer before I get going, I do have a few slides, but I'm only going to use them when they're relevant, so it's going to be mainly me sort of just talking freeform. But I think that this is partially a reflective talk, I think it's slightly more useful just to see my face and hear what I have to say in those terms. I grapple quite a lot with what I was wanting to talk about here today, because I think there are lots of useful directions, for example, case studies and looking at data. But something that I am sitting with myself in my work, but also in the conversations in the different communities I sit in, is how we lay foundations for any intention to reform, innovate, create new. And I am a little bit concerned that sometimes we have these conversations backwards, where we have scholars from the global north being the only voice, where we create change from a position of being harmed in the system, or recognizing complicity in the harm that the education system kind of throws our way, and that there is so much unlearning that we have to do in order to sort of move forward in these conversations. But the institutions want us to act rapidly, they want us to act in short terms, they want us to be limited and ultimately to fail. And in that process, they don't give us space to heal, they don't give us space to reflect on who we are and what our objectives are before we do anything. And so we are already stymied. And so this reflection, and I should just say, if you see me looking down, I am dyspraxic and have no sense of time. So I have a little timer giving me a little nudge, because I could talk for 2 hours and have no idea. But going back to what I was saying, I think that we have to stop and pause, and I want to reflect on sort of 3 of the key areas that I think are necessary for us to make successful inroads as we move forwards. So I sort of talked about having this conversation backwards, and I sort of talked about our process of unlearning. And I think that positionality is crucial to this conversation. And what do I mean by positionality? What I mean is the social and political contexts that make up who we are. That can also include the spheres and the environments in which we sit. And in order to make meaningful progress as individuals, as small and local collectives, but also as a bigger group of people trying to make change, we have to reflect on each of those truths, each of the identities that we're putting forwards. And going back to my point about having the conversation backwards and unlearning, one of the things that I don't see often in these conversations is acknowledging how long we've been in the system. So you heard in my bio, I'm an assistant professor, blah, blah, what does that really mean? What it means is I've been in university education for a decade. It means that I started my undergraduate degree in 2010, and I am relatively unusual in my generation in that I did my undergrad, I went straight into my PhD, straight into a postdoc, and straight into a permanent post. That is very unusual in our current trajectory, and that gives me a very, very specific sightline on what the process is like. And I think that repeatedly, not only seeing that as a form of privilege, but also recognizing that means I haven't had a break from the system, and I have mainly only been at 2 institutions in that time, is integral to me understanding how I interact with the idea of changing pedagogy, what pedagogy looks like, and who the community I interact with is. So when I talk about social and political context, that can mean anything from I went straight through the university system, but I'm mixed race, I'm queer, I'm neurodivergent, I hated school, I underachieved the whole way through to the 3rd year of my undergraduate degree because I hated school. I was undiagnosed neurodivergent, but also I spent years thinking that I just didn't know how to do anything properly, as opposed to asking the wrong questions and not fitting the system. And that is a form of positionality. And it means that when I'm constructing my teaching, it means when I am approaching these issues, when I am thinking about how I talk to students, I am coming from the position of feeling like a misfit. It is statistically negligible that someone of my ethnic heritage will proceed above the rank I currently have as an academic. I have never had a colleague of colour in a department of music in my life. There were almost no other people of colour on my degree. There were no home students in my postgraduate experience, and the marginalisation of international students, particularly at postgraduate level, is something that we don't actually repeatedly acknowledge in this conversation, and that our institutions seek to make distinctions between where you were born and your ability to construct knowledge, and that is part of what we have to interact with. So when I talk about positionality, I think it is necessary to start with who you are, and then it is looking at who you hold space with immediately, every day, and then who you are holding space with more widely. Like, I have an amazing network in a broad sense. I know lots of fabulous and amazing people doing incredible work that I could only ever aspire to, but I don't see that at home. I don't see it so much in my institution. I have to pause conversations about Black History Month to say that we can't have a theme on Black joy and we can't incorporate the abolition of slavery into that conversation. And the fact is I had to have that conversation 3 times. And it's a small example, but it is a necessary one. So what I wanted to do to sort of, I guess, epitomize what I'm talking about is give you a case study that's drawn from my experience, a way in which I have reflected and then attempted to create change, tell you what the change was, and talk about why I'm acting in that way, because I completely agree with what the previous speaker said, that given the question, with unlimited resources, what would you do? I agree, mine would be burn it down, and not in a inherently negative way, but in a we need to start again term. And what I know is at the moment, I can't tear my institution down. What I know is that I have to hold space for my students who are struggling in the system. What I know is that while representation politics is so tiring, representation still matters. You know, when people talk to me about, you know, the attainment gap, however you want to rebrand that, or, you know, the lack of representation of people of colour in higher echelons, I'm like, yeah, but my chances are statistically negligible, and all you do is tell me that. You give me the data telling me I'm not going to get the same bonus as my white colleagues. You like all I do is hear that. So why would I engage with your structures? And so I'm going to just take you back to when I was a PhD student, and I started marking courses. At this stage, I was still trying to understand what the point of university really was, because I sort of grew up in this sort of very romantic environment when I was young, that, you know, knowledge was for everyone, and it didn't matter how it was attributed, in terms of you didn't need qualifications to be wise, and you didn't need a university education to be knowledgeable and an expert. And then I went through the university system of sort of having this idea of a hierarchy of knowledge and a hierarchy of how we create knowledge being repeatedly reinforced, and didn't know what to do with that. So I'm in my PhD. I am in the very familiar position for many people at this stage of being offered lots of teaching associate work, where you're being paid, you know, £3 to mark a 5,000 word essay. You know, we're in that space, and you know how bad it is, and then you find something else that reminds you. And what I encountered in the process of starting to mark modules on popular music and on musical theatre was how profound the misuse of language was around the descriptions of race and ethnicity. And I want to make a distinction here. I'm not talking about an essay with a white supremacist narrative. I'm not talking about anti-Semitism. I'm not talking about anti-blackness. Those essays exist. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about someone who's come in and written a racist piece of work from end to end. I'm talking about the institution, and I mean the university system in the UK in general, when I say that, have fetishized the concept of race to the point that students who do not feel racialized enter and think that they are studying a topic that happens to those people over there, and that they can write about those people over there from a dispassionate or impartial point of view, and that has no consequences. But because of who they are interacting with, there is a lack of recognition of what that perpetuates. And so I didn't have the words that I'm using now, but what I was wrestling with was the lack of acknowledgement that power, language, unlearning, and responsibility have to be connected and part of our pedagogy in order to create safe spaces for everyone involved. And it's not just about the university being safe, like I completely agree about that buzz expression, but in order to move forwards, to create a space where we don't create these hierarchies of knowledge, we have to have the vocabulary and tools to talk about things appropriately. And the one thing that universities don't do is accept that people come from different knowledge bases, that different life experiences exist, and equip people to communicate adequately about everything, as opposed to how to write the definitive essay structure. I'm not really interested in that. Like, I don't think, do you know how to write a good topic sentence, i.e. crystallize your essay into 10 words, is the be all and end all of this process. But what I do think matters is care and responsibility about how we talk about what we teach. And in order to reform what we teach, what we see as knowledge, what we see as a teaching experience, and getting rid of that hierarchy of the lecturer knowing everything and the students absorbing stuff from the lecturer, we have to talk about responsibility of language. We have to go back and think about the very core essentials of what universities want us to take for granted. So I sat with this, I think probably for a term where, you know, I was incredibly thrown and also without a peer really to talk to, and wasn't really sure what the right answer was. And then I had an idea about talking about responsibility, and I started teaching at a different institution in a much more racially diverse environment, and hearing the students responding to how I teach as opposed to how someone else teaches and I support, and the openness and frankness of some of the conversations that were taking place, and decided that I would tell them in advance that I was going to try something. And I signposted all of the sort of potential risks in advance, gave them access to the materials in advance, and tested it out. And I went from reading somewhere between 35 and 50 inflammatory, harmful representations to 1 or 2 in a semester. And that rate of change is significant, which is why I want to talk about it. And I have used this system I'm going to show you now, which I have refined over the few years in almost all the teaching that I do. And it isn't decolonizing, but what it is injecting a dialogue about responsibility and not holding the responsibility with any one person or any one community. So I'm going to share those slides and talk you through them a little bit, and then I will sort of hopefully wrap up with a little bit of, bang on time, touch wood.